So the last basic structure that I'm going to talk about with Python are functions, and this is a bit of a advanced topic, but I'll just introduce them really quickly. And functions are a way to wrap together code into kind of small modules or tools that you can reference later within your script. So there's a lot of use for functions, but you can think of it starting out as a way to encapsulate operations that you do all the time. So for instance, if you find yourself having to add 2 to a number lots of times, you can actually create a function to do that addition. And actually, a lot of the things we've already used are functions. They just happen to be built in the basic Python. So when we do things like append, what's actually happening is Python is finding the function somewhere in the system for how to do this, and it's running pieces of code that are pre-built to do this operation. And in the same exact way, we can build our own operations that are particular to what we want to do. So for instance, if I want to make an adding function, I could start with a keyword def, which stands for define. So here we're defining a function. And then we declare the name of our function. So here I'll say adding machine. And in parentheses, we pass the variables that will control our machine. So here we actually dictate how many pieces of data need to be input into our function to make it work. So we'll just have 1, and it's going to be a number. And then colon, again, like always. And now everything within this chunk of code will be defined by this function, and it will run each time that function is called, and it will do something to this input. So in this case, I just want to add 2 to this number, so I'm just going to simply say num equals num plus 2. So a shortcut for this syntax when you're adding things to a number, or what's called iterating in programming, there's a shortcut for this. Instead of writing num equals num plus 2, you can just say plus equals. And this is a shortcut for adding something to a number. Okay, so in this case, if you pass in num, this is going to add 2 to that num. And then to output data from our function, we use the return keyword. And return will basically output whatever you want from this function. So in this case, we're going to output our number back out of the function. Okay, so once you're done writing that function, you can go back to our main line here, and now we can start to call this function. And to do that, we just write the name of the function, and then again in parentheses, we'll pass whatever we want that function to operate on. So this should be the number that we want to add 2 to. And if we hit test, the function is run, but we didn't do anything to the output. Okay, so by default, this function will run, but because we didn't assign this function to anything, the output kind of gets lost. So in order to capture that output, we just have to create a new variable. So we'll just say added num, just a variable I made, equals this function. And this syntax will basically create a variable, and it'll execute this function, and anything that returns from this function will be assigned to this added num. And as a last step, we'll just print that returned number. So hit test. You can see here we have a 4. Just to make this more illustrative, we can actually return a statement. So here I'll type result is colon, and then like before, I'll use the plus to concatenate this piece of string, and then I'll convert this number to a string with the str function. Okay, and now instead of outputting a number, it's going to actually output a string. So there's our final output from that function. So that's a really basic function, but you can see how flexible this can become, because you can actually specify any amount of inputs. They can be anything, and this function will perform a set of operations. So instead of maybe passing 1 number, we can actually pass 2 numbers. So here I'll say num1, num2, and I'll actually add them to each other. So here I'll say result equals num1 plus num2, and then instead of num, I'll output the result. And since we're changing the amount of inputs, we also have to correlate that with what we're passing in. So you can see here, the function adding machine is expecting 2 inputs. We only give it 1, so Python will create an error which basically says that you've given 1 input and it expects 2 arguments. So in this case, we'll put in our 2 inputs, and you can see here, just like with list, the different inputs are just separated by a comma, and this should just match up. So here we're passing two specific numbers. Here it's just taking those numbers and assigning that to these variables. Then we can work with these variables, and then we output it to the return of the function. So now we hit test, and you see it's giving us a result. And the cool thing about functions too is that you can kind of wrap up this logic, but once you have this function, you don't really need to know what all of the internal variables were being called. Those are kind of local to the script itself. So we can use, we can pass it any of our own kind of variables, whether numbers or other variables, and we can specify this output name, and doesn't have to correlate to what we called it in the function itself. So that's a kind of a basic quick overview of the key sort of structures, and this will let you get started with scripting and help us in developing our actual exercises in the next section.